Hi, I'm Phil, and this is The Joy of Electronics. In this video, we're going to continue working on this Civil War Big Muff Pi clone. I've done a couple of videos previously on this pedal. If you haven't seen it, I did a video on how to wire the switch, the stomp switch. I'll put a link to that up in the corner here. Card. Did a video on how to wire the mod switch to scoop the mids and boost the mids, so there's a video on that. Put that up in the corner. And I did a video on how to wire the AC jack and the battery terminal along with this stereo input jack so that the battery is switched off when you plug in AC, or an AC adapter I should say, and that both of those are switched off until something is plugged into the input jack. So I've also placed you can see below the circuit board is a little piece of cardboard that's cut out, and it fits in there snugly. It doesn't move. And what that's going to do, it's going to prevent the components or the solder on the underside of the circuit board or the PC board from touching the enclosure and shorting out anything. So generally you want to have something, depending on whether the circuit board is face up or face down, you're going to need something to prevent the circuit board from touching the enclosure. So having wired the stomp switch for the most part, I haven't wired the LED indicator to the stomp switch, which is over here, and it'll take up these two of these pins over here. I've got to wire the potentiometers, which you see here, as well as the LED, and that's basically it for this pedal. So I'll be doing that in this video, starting with the potentiometers. Now, potentiometers are the pin out, pins 1, 2, 3, are numbered as if the potentiometer was facing up. So this would be pin 1, this would be pin 2, this would be pin 3. So when we're looking at the potentiometer from the opposite side, we're going the opposite way. So pin 1, pin 2, pin 3. So make sure you're wiring those correctly. These potentiometers are actually meant to be mounted like through hole in a circuit board. If I have something handy, I'll just grab one here. You know, they'll mount right into the holes generally, like that. So that's the intention of this type of potentiometer mount. The more appropriate type for exactly what I'm doing here with the pedal would be what's called solder lugs, which would be little ring terminals here that you could solder to. But it's not a big deal to use these circuit board mount potentiometers, and I've got a plan. I've done one already. You can't really see it, but it's down in there. What I'm going to try is something new with this pedal, wiring up the potentiometers. I'm going to try doing little loops. So I've stripped the wire, and then I'll curl it over like that, a little loop, and then I'm going to thread that loop onto the potentiometer terminal and solder it on that way. Using your needle nose is one way to do this. So another way to create this type of loop is with a tool. Let me strip off a bit here. These things are jewelry loopers, a little over-engineered, but they're fun. So you can just put your bare wire in there, squeeze them together, and they're going to trim it and create a nice little loop. You end up basically with the same if you're using your needle nose to do it, but I really liked how these worked, and they're inexpensive, so I picked them up, and I use them more for fun than anything else. So I'm not quite sure how this looping is going to go on these pots. I haven't done it this way before. I've done one already. The only downside that I can see is that, you know, it's going to be a little hard to get heat shrink over those loops, if at all, but the loops are going to be at least at the you know, the top end of the potentiometer, so that there's not going to be heat shrink over that anyways. The heat shrink's mainly to go over these pins if I don't cut them, if I don't cut the excess. So we'll see. I've got these two that have to go to pin 3 of the tone pot. This is the tone pot, and as we talked about, pins 1 would be 1, 2, 3. So pin 1, 2, 3 is pretty tight under this jack. Now I could, you know what, I probably should take the jack out, peel it back a bit so that I have access there. I didn't want to do that, but you know what, I think that's the way to go. I'll just have to rebend some of these wires to look nice after. I mean, it's always tempting to, you know, put the hardware on so that you see what it all looks like, but you know, in this case the access makes it quite difficult. Now hopefully I have enough length here on all these wires that I've bent so specifically. Well, that's going to give me probably enough, although all depends on which wires I want to go under which other wires. Let's peel these out through here, and then down, and then around. So here we go. It's much better access for me. I don't know if you're going to be able to see as well. So I've already put loops in those two, and a bit of heat shrink on. I'm not sure how I'm going to get that heat shrink around the corner that I need to, but first let's deal with getting the loops on. So I've got the loops in the wires. So I think I have to just bend them at a 90-degree angle so that they'll sit up on the potentiometer pin. One thing I do like about these loops, or at least I'm hoping to like, is that the multiple wires should stack up nicely. You know, you just thread one loop on, and then you just thread the next loop on. So we'll see how that works here. So, you know, this sort of thing's always tricky business. So that's one loop threaded on, working pretty good. Nice mechanical connection there. That's another thing I like about this loop method, is that, you know, these loops are not coming off, especially when they're soldered. So you don't have to worry as much about holding things in place. And there is, nope, not quite. A little too much length on these wires, so being a little tricky. There, they are on. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to get the heat shrink around. Let's see if our jack fits in. The jack will fit in, and it's not going to short anything, so that's good. So I'm going to go ahead and solder these, and then we'll see if we can get the heat shrink around the corner. I don't know if you can see that. There's our two loops on the pin. And it's soldered up nicely. So what I'll do is I'll get that heat shrink around, and I'll solder up the rest of these pots, and then we'll move on to the LED. Okay, so I've soldered up the tone potentiometer, and the looping method worked really well, actually. I just looped these leads and put them on. This one with two leads was tricky to get the heat shrink over, but it did go over. It's a larger heat shrink diameter than these two, but these two went really well. Make the loop, slide it on, a little solder, and then the heat shrink. So I'll go ahead and do the rest of the potentiometers as I said, and then we'll move on to the LED. Okay, I'm Phil. This is the joy of electronics, and we're going to finish up this clone of a Civil War Big Muff pie. You can start at the beginning of the video series if you want to see this build from start to finish. It's on strip board. We've gone through every stage from wiring the strip board to drilling and finishing the enclosure. Now wiring the pedal, and now we're on to the last step, which is wiring up this LED indicator. So the way that it's going to get wired is it's going to get its 9-volt power from the circuit board here. This red lead coming off, we're going to trim that, and that's going to go here, and then it's going to get its ground from the switch. So we're going to wire the LED to this terminal of our stomp switch, and we're going to wire the ground, which is this black lead here, to this terminal of the stomp switch. And in that sense, when the pedal is engaged, these terminals will be connected and the LED will go on, theoretically. So let's get to it. So I thought what I'd do is I'd been doing this a lot on this build. I'll make a little loop. We need a resistor, and so I've got, I think, a 220 ohm resistor here for the LED. I'm going to make a loop on the positive end of the LED, which is the longer lead, and I think we'll solder, just make sure some heat shrink will go over that. It'll be tight. I've got some heat shrink for this. It's a bit tight, so I'll make this loop a little smaller, and this probably isn't the best way to do this. It's just the way I do it. So we'll end up just, you know what, we'll just loop the resistor around as well, and we'll solder it that way. Then we'll put the heat shrink on afterwards. So there we go. That's a, I don't know if that's a nice mechanical connection. They're not coming apart, but they're not making great contact. Or contact is definitely not guaranteed in that situation. So how am I going to do this? We'll get my third hand here. Hold on to the LED. And I probably want this to go at a 90-degree angle, even though the heat shrink might have some trouble going around that. We'll deal with it in a second. There we go. Pretty good. Pretty well soldered. We'll make another loop on the other side of this resistor to solder our 9-volt lead to. There we go. That's looking pretty good. I think we'll try it like that. That's in the right direction. So that'll come up. I'll trim it. That looks like plenty. Kind of tight to pull, so I'll just grab this with the others. where's our heat shrink? Seems like maybe it got... Oh, there it is. I thought it got away from us. Always remember, so I want the heat shrink to cover the resistor as much as possible. So we want quite a bit of it. That's the one we want. Feed this around the corner. We can bend this to shape afterwards so that it looks a bit nicer, but for now we just need to get this heat shrink out of the way so that we can solder. Actually, we don't even have to have this LED in, we can just take it out actually. And bend this around. Put it back in just a, well, let's see where would be a good place to hold it. That looks pretty good. Just tighten it up a bit. Yeah, that looks like it'll hold nicely. Or not. Or not, it'll just fall over. There we go. We'll sort it out in a second. Okay. Here we go. Our heat shrink got a little heated up. Hopefully we have enough. Yeah, you gotta be careful around a heat shrink. Make sure it doesn't shrink prematurely. There we go. You know what? We'll bend the lead a bit so that we get right over. Try to get as much coverage with this heat shrink as possible because this is a positive lead. And there we have it. Could have used a bit more heat shrink actually, but we're fine. Let's go. With that, and we'll shrink that in place. And if you want this tidier, you can put the heat shrink, or sorry, the resistor, make room for it on the circuit. I figure if I'm going to have to replace that, I can just replace the whole LED. It's not a big deal to have it just soldered in line with the 9-volt lead. So that's our positive. So for the ground, we want the ground to go to the center terminal. On our switch, so we don't need that much length. Don't need that much length either, but we'll take it for now. We'll trim it right after, right here. Just bend it a bit so it hooks on. You know, we'll solder it, and then I'll trim it down to size. There we go. You gotta be careful with these switches. Don't linger too long with the heat. If it's taking too long, back off. Let it cool down, and then start again. So you can melt the terminals out, as I've mentioned in a previous video. So there we have our ground Now we just have to wire the switch to the actual LED. So I'll put another loop on the LED lead. Make the job a bit easier. Straighten that a bit. Get another length of black hookup wire here. On our switch. Okay, now how are we going to get down to that? Looks like we should probably go below the 9-volt. We can probably trim it and strip it first, so I'll go about there. I think that's plenty. Probably end up taking more of this off, but that's fine. Sneak it below the 9-volt lead. And then we'll just hook it under that little loop we made. And we'll loop it around and we're good to solder on. Solder that. Trim, and the wiring of this pedal is done. Jump down there a bit with a little bend, try to straighten this out so it looks like everything was intentional, which of course it is. And there we have it. Now I'll just quickly hook up my power supply and we'll test it out. So we've got our minus there. Positive there. Let's find something a bit better. Let's use our Mr. Sketch. That looks nicer. Alrighty. Turn our power supply on. We have an input switch, so I'll have to grab plug that in. Turn on the juice. That's not the input jack, that's the output jack. So we'll just go around the other side. And there we go. We've got our LED. Pedal complete. So now we'll move on to a quick test of the audio.